All right, so in the last lecture we talked about the basic utilitarian framework. In the next couple lectures, I want to talk about just evaluating utilitarianism, some challenges to the theory, some objections, and how the utilitarian might handle them. We'll get more into this when we do the case studies. We'll really sort of test the theory, see what its strengths and weaknesses are. I think it's worth, taking a first pass at some of these issues before we do that, just to see what they are, how a utilitarian might respond. So how'd you guys read Bentham for the basic presentation of utilitarianism? Because I think Bentham is very good at that, right? You guys might have noticed Bentham's a little dry, but whatever. He's not the greatest prose stylist in the world. We're reading Mill for sort of objections to utilitarianism and responses. A lot of times people will read Mill as their presentation of utilitarianism. I don't think Mill does a very good job of that. He does much better thinking about possible objections. So we'll look at him for that. Anyway, before getting into this, I want to go back to remember our sort of 3 steps or 3 points for evaluating a moral theory, formulating and evaluating a moral theory. So try to come up with a theory that explains moral judgments we're sure about. Test the theory against other moral claims and judgments that we're sure about. And remember here, it's not just that the theory gives us the right answer, right? It's that the theory gives us the right answer for good reasons, right? With egoism, or at least the forms of crude egoism, if it's like, well, you shouldn't murder your relatives for the inheritance because you might get caught and then you would go to jail and that would be bad. Well, might give you the right answer, don't murder your relatives for the inheritance, but the reasoning there, like don't do it because you might get caught and go to jail and jail's not fun, yeah, that's just bizarre, right? That doesn't seem like a good moral reason. Might be a good reason not to commit murder, it doesn't seem like a moral reason, right? Then finally we want to apply the theory to less certain cases. Does it give us an answer? How well does it do with that? And now look, I'm going to put a lot of pressure on utilitarianism in this slideshow, in the next slideshow, the next couple lectures, also in the case studies, but I want to emphasize that utilitarianism does a pretty good job with a lot of this. If it didn't, we wouldn't take the theory seriously. It'd be like egoism, hey, this is fun to think about, but let's move on, let's not talk about it anymore. We're going to talk a lot about utilitarianism because even if you don't like utilitarianism, even if you don't think it's a good moral theory, even if you have problems with it, and I certainly would at the very least say I have some problems with it, it is a theory worth taking seriously. And think about this, right? Remember we talked about like the Skylab case, the antidote case. We're pretty sure about those and a lot of other moral judgments. And utilitarianism does a good job with that. Why bring down the space station over the outback instead of over, populated Southern California? Because it's less likely to hurt anybody, right? Why give the antidote to the 2 people instead of the 1? Because we want to save the most lives on balance. And if we test the theory against other moral claims and judgments we're sure about, it does a pretty good job too, right? Why is murder wrong? Well, murder is wrong because of the sadness it creates among the people who care about the victim. It hurts them, it makes them less happy. It's wrong because it deprives the victim of all future happiness. We think life is more pleasant than not on balance. If someone kills somebody, they deprive the victim of all future happiness. That's a bad thing. Not only does a utilitarian tell us murder's wrong, they give us a pretty good answer why that is, right? Why is fraud wrong? Well, there's the harm done to the person who's defrauded. They lose their money or whatever. There's also the psychological harm done to them, the unhappiness of being taken advantage of by someone you trusted. There's the damage to overall social trust. Everybody else hears about it, they're less trusting. that seems a pretty darn good account of why fraud is wrong. Apply the theory to less certain cases. We'll see how well utilitarianism does with this, but this seems very promising, right? The utilitarian at least thinks they have an almost moral mathematics that you can almost just set up an equation for uncertain cases and get an answer. That's certainly what Bentham thinks. The utilitarian at least thinks we're going to do real well with 3. Okay. So, we've seen why it's a theory that's worth taking seriously, what its merits are. Let's now talk about the challenges to the theory. In the reading I had you guys look at, the first worry that Mill considers, or the first charge against utilitarianism, is that utilitarianism sets the standard too high. So, the reason for this is utilitarianism requires that we weigh everyone's interest equally. Well, but think about this, right? Morality is going to put some limits on self-interest. Unless you're an ethical egoist, you just think that's true, and just intuitively, just before you took an ethics class, I'm guessing all of you thought that was the case. And that does seem the intuitive view, right? Morality puts some limits on self-interest. You could get a job, you could get a promotion by lying about your rival for the promotion, destroying his reputation. You really want the promotion, it would be wrong to do that. Morality says you got to take your chances, even though you might not get it if you don't play dirty against your opponent, right? Not even really, I guess, your opponent, your colleague, right? And most of us say, yeah, morality says you got to limit your self-interest here. You might really want that promotion. You can't do that. And it says that about a lot of things. But I think most of us also think that morality allows us some leeway to pursue our own ends. I shouldn't have to spend every second of every day trying to help others. Think of the promotion case. It would be immoral to do your rival for the promotion dirty, to wreck his reputation, to lie about him. But most of us would think it's above and beyond the call of duty to say, well, he really wants it, he'll be really sad if he doesn't get it, so I should withdraw mine, right? No, you can pursue your self-interest even if, if you're the person chosen, that might make him sad. We also think that we have some leeway to give preference to those we care about and who are close to us. If I can help my children or the children of a stranger, if I have the money to send, say, my children to college or a stranger's children to college, perfectly fine to prefer my own children to pay their way to college, not to pay the stranger's children's way to college. Most of us would think, right? In fact, most of us would say that we're morally required to do that. It would be weird to take your own children's college fund and spend it on the children of strangers. Most of us would even blame someone who did that, right? My grandmother actually had a stepmother that really didn't like this woman, and one of the reasons she didn't like her was, she was one of those churchy types who's always more holier than thou. And one of the things this woman did was, my grandmother's family was not rich, but they were by this point middle class, right? And so the stepmother said, well, you guys are middle class, so we just took all the money that we were going to spend on Christmas presents for you, and we used it to we donated it to a charity who will buy Christmas presents for poor children. I think my grandmother's father was kind of a doormat who, just went along with this kind of thing. But never met my great-grandfather, but I don't think he had a huge amount of spine. But, easy for a stepmother to do, but, especially we think, well, no, you should probably buy your own children Christmas presents. Maybe if you want to go above and beyond, you can get them less nice Christmas presents to help the poor children. But, you know, it's a little weird to do, and it's certainly not something most of us think you're required to do. Now, I want you guys to think about why utilitarianism might be at odds with both of these claims. All right. We'll talk a bit more about this in the case studies, but for the time being, I want to talk about this distinction between supererogatory actions and morally required. So morally required means you have a duty or obligation to do this. It would be wrong not to do it. Don't commit murder, right? Don't murder other people. Don't defraud others. Don't lie to people and manipulate them to get what you want. If you can easily save the life of another person without any risk to yourself, or you can prevent severe injury to them without any risk to yourself or real sacrifice, you should do it, right? Take a famous philosopher's case. If I see a child drowning in shallow water, and I'm the only person around, and I can save this kid by wading into the water, getting my pants a little wet and dirty, I have a duty to do that. If I hear somebody being attacked on the street, and they're in real danger, at the very least I have a duty to call the police or to do something to try to get help there. Maybe I don't have to run between somebody and somebody's chasing them with a knife, but I have some duty to try to prevent this other person from being harmed if I can do it without any real risk to myself, right? If I'm somebody who hears someone screaming for help and just closes my window, turns my music up, that would be a bad thing to do. One thing, and I can't resist telling you guys this, there's the famous Kitty Genovese case where the neighbors supposedly listened to her screaming for help and didn't call the police. That's actually complete bull. The neighbors did call the police. The New York Times completely botched the case. So the story you hear of the Genovese case is complete nonsense. The New York Times talked to some police lieutenant. He fed them a line of complete, cow manure, to put it gently. They bought it. They didn't fact check it. They published the story. You get this pervasive urban myth that nobody tried to help her, which is just not true. Anyway, if one of your future psych professors or somebody tries to use this case as an example, you can tell them they're wrong about it, because they are. This podcast I liked actually called You Wrong About. They did a whole episode on Genovese. You want a source, that's a good source. Anyway, I digress. Back to my point. You have a duty to do these things. But there are other things you don't have a duty to do. They would be really nice to do. They would be wonderful of you to do. They would be heroic or saintly. But you're not morally required to do this. Here's a few examples, right? Giving a kidney to a complete stranger. That would be a wonderful, saintly thing to do. But most of us don't think that those of us who don't do it are bad people. It would be nice, it would be heroic, it would be wonderful. You're not obligated to do it. Give all of your money to help the poor, right? That would be nice, that would be wonderful. We don't think we're obligated to do that. At least most of us don't, right? Pay the college tuition of some bright kid whom you barely know, right? Even if you don't have to sacrifice your own kid's college tuition, most of us think, paying for the college of a bright education of a bright stranger, nice, but not something morally required. Risking your life to save the life of another person, right? If you hear someone screaming for help in the street from your safe apartment, most of us think you have an obligation to call the cops, right? Get this person some help. If you see a kid drowning in shallow water, most of us think you should reach in and pull the kid out, right? It's above and beyond the call of duty for you to run out in the street and put yourself between the person and the person chasing them with a knife, right? It's above and beyond the call of duty if someone falls on the subway tracks to jump down on top of them, push them down, and let the train run over both of you. Like, right? People do this, and it's heroic. We celebrate them. We don't think it's morally required, right? Well, the worry with utilitarianism is that it will say we actually have a duty to perform actions we think of as supererogatory. Right? Think of it this way, right? We'll just use one example here. You know, think of the bright child, the bright kid who can't afford college, right? If you spend that money on yourself, if you bought a nicer house or a car, how much happiness is that going to bring you? Well, but if you use it to pay for somebody's college, how much happiness will that bring them? We'll talk about the kidney case in, one of the case studies. But again, think about money, right? If you're relatively well off, couldn't $100, if you're making let's say you make $100,000 a year, right? What could you buy with an extra $100 that you don't already have? Well, think of somebody making $10,000 a year. What could they buy with the $100 they don't already have? How much happiness would what you could buy bring you? How much happiness would it bring the poor person? If you're a utilitarian, wouldn't you have to give your money away to the poorer person because it brings more happiness for him? Or we can even go back to my first example, the Duran Duran tickets, much more minor. We gave them to Liz, but would we have done anything wrong if we kept them, right? Are we morally required to give her these tickets just because she likes Duran Duran a lot more than we do? The utilitarian would actually say if we don't give her the tickets, we've done something wrong because it makes her a lot happier than it would us. To me, it seems like, well, we've done something nice by giving them to her. We wouldn't have done anything wrong by not giving them to her, right? So Mills says there is no issue here. Mills like, well, look. Most of us will create the most happiness by looking out for ourselves and those closest to us. You will create the most happiness by, looking out for yourself and your own children and your own dependents, the people you know and care about. And Mills says this. He says, well, look, unless you're the Prime Minister of Britain or, the president of a corporation or some really powerful person, you don't really have any opportunity to affect the happiness of anyone except yourself and those close to you. If you are just the average person, there's nothing you can do, so says John Stuart Mill, that will affect the happiness of somebody halfway around the world from you, right? Is that really true, though? I want to push pretty hard on this, especially when we get to the case studies. But I don't want to be unfair to Mill. When Mill wrote this in 1863, it was probably true. Or it might have been true, or it might not have been crazy. I can see why Mill wrote this. I really doubt that it's true now, though. I think this self-sacrifice problem is way worse for the utilitarian than Mill lets on. Or than Mill thinks. Because I don't think he's being insincere. I don't think he's trying to feed us a line. I really think he thinks that, this is true. Look out for yourself and those close to you. But what has changed between now and 1863? Why do you and I probably or almost certainly have a lot more ability to affect the happiness of people who aren't close to us than John Stuart Mill thought. Think about that, and we'll pick it up in class. All right. Another objection to utilitarianism, and one that I think Mill has a better answer to, is this objection that there's no time to calculate. Now look, this looks like a pretty pressing objection, right? You have Bentham's long utilitarian calculus, duration, number of people affected, intensity, fecundity, like how likely it is to lead to future and pleasures and pains. Just imagine trying to do this calculation in the real world. I see this every day, and I'm surprised people don't get run over, but they don't. I guess bus drivers are on top of their game. But imagine, you see one of these cell phone zombies, as I would call them, people who are just glued to their cell phone, just like wandering out into the world. You see somebody like face buried in a cell phone, speeding bus or speeding car. He's about to step out in front of it. He has no idea the car or the bus is not going to stop in time. Heck, if it's a car, we can imagine that person's on their cell phone too. They're going to run this guy over. You could yell, or you could try to grab his shirt and stop him from stepping off the curb in front of this car. But you have to do your utilitarian calculation. You're like, well, people affected, person and his family, the person in the car is going to be sad. Well, possible bad consequences. Well, maybe he's the next Hitler, but that's not likely, and we have to play the odds, and future pleasures and pains. Well, if I step out in front of the car, I get hurt, but I don't have to step off the curb, so I'm fine. Okay, I'll save him. Right? And while you were doing the utilitarian calculus, what's going to happen? This dude's going to get creamed by the car. It's going to be too late, right? And not only would horrible things happen while you were calculating, especially in real world events where things are moving quick, it would just be exhausting to go around constantly calculating. Well, what does Mill say about this? Well, Mill says in most circumstances, you don't need to calculate, and you should not. If you follow ordinary morality most of the time, it will create the most happiness. You see a guy about to step in front of a bus, you should yell at him, and if that doesn't work, maybe grab his shirt and pull him back, right? You worry about, should you lie to a friend to get money? No, you don't need to do the utilitarian calculus. You can just know that's not a good thing to do, right? Mill has a good analogy here. It was good at the time, the Sailor's Almanac analogy. This was the 1860s. Sailors would go out on the ocean, and they would use the sky to navigate. But of course, especially if you're in the middle of a storm or something, you don't have time to do this complicated math and measurement. You have this Sailor's Almanac that has the math already done for you. You take a measure of the stars, you look it up in the almanac, you do what it says. You don't have to sit there and do all this complicated math. Mill will say ordinary morality is like the Sailor's Almanac. The calculations have been done for us. You don't need to constantly think about the consequences. Well, then, you might say, what's the point of utilitarianism? And Mill would say, well, look. In weird situations, it's good to be able to calculate, right? If you were out on the sea and the measurements just didn't make sense, you couldn't make sense of the almanac, it would be very good to be able to actually do the calculations. Even today, the Navy makes people learn how to navigate by the stars and do the calculations. It's a thing that's useful to have, right? And in weird situations, you wonder if there's a good reason to lie to somebody. Well, usually there's not, but, this person's really fragile, or they might be really hot-headed, and if you worry if you tell them the truth, they're going to go do something stupid. maybe you want to calculate there just to make sure ordinary morality holds. Or two rules of ordinary morality might conflict, right? You know, an example we'll talk about later, you shouldn't lie to people. You also shouldn't let people murder other people if you can prevent it, right? Well, if someone comes to your door, if a murderer is looking for his intended victim, let's say the victim's hiding in your house, the murderer comes to the door and they're like, "Hey, looking for my friend. You know where he is?" Well, you shouldn't lie, but you also shouldn't help the murderer find his victim. Utilitarianism would say, well, moral rules conflict. Here it's useful to calculate. If you lie to this guy and lie well, you say, yeah, I saw him, he ran down the street there. You close the door behind, him, lock the door, call the cops. The odds are that's going to have much better consequences than saying, oh yeah, he was in a panic, he knocked on the door and he went and hid in the bedroom. If you don't see him, he might be under the bed, right? The odds of bad consequences there, murderer is going to kill his victim, he might very well kill you too, right? And Mill will say calculating is also useful because ordinary morality might be wrong. The calculations in the Sailor's Almanac might be off. And so it's useful to check it. An example from Mill's own time, Victorian society, in which Mill lived, was just incredibly sexist. Women were barred from most professions. They were kept from developing their talents. And Mill will say, look, if you just keep a whole half the population, basically treat them like children and don't let them contribute or develop their talents, that's bad for them. That has bad consequences for society. Mill wrote this whole book, The Subjugation of Women, basically making a utilitarian argument that common sense morality in Victorian times about relations between the genders was just completely off, right? It got the calculations wrong. We need to fix it. So we can examine ordinary morality and we might need to reform it. The calculations might be off. So I actually think Mill has a really good answer to this whole no time to calculate thing. Here, I tend to agree with Mill. He does pretty well. So the next objection to utilitarianism is the bad faith objection. And so how does this work? What's the worry here? So utilitarianism says that we should do whatever creates the most happiness. Now, the utilitarian will say certain things are really unlikely to create the most happiness. Killing an innocent person is unlikely to create the most happiness. Framing someone for a crime they didn't commit is unlikely to create the most happiness. You usually shouldn't do that. But what a utilitarian cannot say is that certain things are in principle always wrong and are ruled out. Then this seems to be a problem for utilitarianism. Seems like utilitarianism can justify obviously immoral actions like stealing or even killing the innocent, right? And let me put this, let's not put too fine a point on this, right? Let me just put this the most blunt and memorable way I know that it's ever been put. Elizabeth Anscombe, very influential philosopher mid-century, was talking about, utilitarianism, and she said, well, look, if someone asked you, is it wrong to boil a baby alive? The proper answer is, oh my God, no. Of course not. Never. That is evil. Why would you even think of that? No. The utilitarian answer to is it okay to boil a baby alive is like, well, almost certainly not, but we need to know about the consequences of doing it versus the consequences of not doing it. And now I should give you guys some context, right? Anscombe was criticizing Harry Truman's decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this was justified in purely utilitarian terms, right? Lower casualties if we drop these bombs, get the Japanese to surrender without invading than if we have to invade. And now look, I'm not so sure, Anscombe was a person who did not doubt her own moral judgments, well, at all, right? She was pretty sanctimonious. I mean, well, very sanctimonious, right? And I'm not so sure if I would judge Truman as harshly as she does. I don't know. Seems a very hard dilemma. But the deeper worry here is that since utilitarianism rules out nothing in principle, you can use it to justify terrible, immoral actions that are obviously wrong, right? Dropping napalm on civilians in the Vietnam War was justified in utilitarian terms, right? We need to win this war. This will help us win this war. Not winning will have these terrible consequences. The Vietnam War and the Iraq War were both justified in utilitarian terms. There was this domino theory of like, oh, if we don't fight this war in Vietnam, all of Asia is going to go communist, and, communism will keep spreading, and then America will become communist, right? The Iraq War, you got these utilitarian justifications, it's going to spread freedom and democracy everywhere in the Middle East. It'll be great. Colonialism was justified in utilitarian terms, right? It was justified in other terms. Sometimes it was like, well, we want to bring Christianity to these people. But it was also justified in utilitarian terms, right? Oh, we colonize these distant lands. That's whatever, but we will bring civilization and economic development. It'll be great for them. Well, look, and I think for all these cases, there's no question that the consequences were terrible, so they weren't actually justified in utilitarian terms. But the worry is, well, it looked like they were, right? It looks like utilitarian reasoning can justify doing terrible things. It looks like utilitarianism is a form of reasoning that can lead you wrong. So what does Mill say about this? Mill will say any moral system can be used to justify terrible things if the person is insincere, right? Think of Christianity and the love your neighbor as yourself. Well, people could twist this into like, well, we're going to burn heretics because, being a heretic is so wrong that, love for everybody, we want to make sure these heretics don't hurt people, right? And I think that's an utter perversion of Christianity, but that would be Mill's point, right? Here is as nice a moral claim as you would ever want, love your neighbor as yourself, and an insincere person can twist that around to justify doing terrible harm. Mill will say, well, utilitarianism's no different. If someone wants to justify doing something shabby, yes, they can do it in utilitarian terms, but that's the same as with any moral theory. Any moral system can be twisted and used to justify terrible things. And Mill will say any moral system will have to be flexible enough to figure out exceptions to rules or what to do when they conflict, right? And Mill will say, look, think about the lying to a murderer case, right? Here we have don't lie versus, don't allow murder to kill somebody. We have a conflict of moral rules. Utilitarianism can tell you what to do in a principled way, and it can do this in other cases when moral rules conflict. So I think there is something to this, but I'm not so sure that utilitarianism can be let off the hook. Think of it this way, right? If you are stupid and careless, you can hurt yourself using any power tool. If you are stupid and careless, you can hurt or kill yourself in any car. But some power tools are safer than others, right? If you have all these safety features like finger guards and, there's table saws that have all this technology, if they even nick your finger, the saw will like fall into the table and won't hurt you anymore. That's a way safer table saw than one that'll just chop right through your hand without stopping, right? If you are doing 90 and you hit a telephone pole with a modern car, you will probably be killed. But there are these cars from the 60s where people would have fender benders at 25 miles an hour, and the car would be fine, but, all the force of the accident was transferred to the passengers. People have accidents at 25 miles an hour and everybody's dead, right, or horribly maimed. If you have an accident, you're way less likely to be hurt in a modern car than one from the 60s. If you've got to do some work, you're way less likely to hurt yourself with power tools that have all these safety features than you are ones that have none. If you're stupid and careless enough, you can figure out a way to hurt yourself, but it's harder, right? And I think Mill's right that any theory can be misused to justify terrible things. But might not some theories be worse than others? And might not utilitarianism be one that's particularly bad for this? And utilitarianism, as I said, does seem to have justified some really bad things. The Vietnam War and the Iraq War, for instance. And if you look, and we'll talk about this, Mill would just say, well, this is bad utilitarian reasoning. But you can offer a utilitarian case for the Vietnam War and the Iraq War. When we talk about natural law theory, we'll talk about natural law theory and just war theory. Especially the Iraq War wouldn't have even gotten off the ground with just war theory. It just doesn't satisfy one of its conditions. Just war theory would say, no, this war is wrong. The condition it doesn't satisfy is last resort. We'll talk more about that. But, you can make a utilitarian case for the Vietnam War and the Iraq War. Natural law theory, you can't even make a case. And while we're at it, we should talk about colonialism, right? Colonialism, not only can you make a utilitarian case for colonialism, John Stuart Mill did. Not only did John Stuart Mill make a utilitarian case for colonialism, he was a colonialist in the truest sense of the term. He worked for the British East India Company his entire life. That was his day job. And now we'll talk about Kantianism in a few weeks. Mill told himself and told others this utilitarian story of like, oh, we're civilizing these people. It's going to be great for them. It's great for us because we get some resources and stuff, but it's great for them because we bring British civilization, blah, 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 right? They get so many benefits from us. Kant, who we'll talk about in a few weeks, Kant was not the best on this. When Kant was younger, he'd said some racist, not great things. He was pretty dismissive of other cultures. When Kant developed his moral theory, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, his moral theory said colonialism was full stop wrong. And Kant revised his views. Kant went from saying, maybe colonialism's justified to like, oh, wait, my moral theory says colonialism's wrong. You know what? Colonialism is wrong. You cannot even tell a story in Kantian moral theory where colonialism's okay. In utilitarian theory, you can. And John Stuart Mill did. So I think this utilitarianism in bad faith, this idea that utilitarianism can justify doing some terrible things, that it might be especially prone to that, that's a worry that Mill should take more seriously than he does. In fact, Mill is himself a pretty good case study of how it can do that.